So once again, thank you so much. My name is Rob Luzinski with the Stewardship Network. And first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Stewardship Network. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based TSN member communities from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of each month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. Now, many of you will know, because we've been talking about it nonstop, that the Stewardship Network Spring Challenge went from April 12th to June 30th of this year. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the challenge throughout the years. It's been built to increase the impact and awareness of collaborative stewardship activities since 2008. It was formerly known as the Garlic Mustard Challenge and then as the Spring Invasive Species Challenge. And the work is happening, but Spring Challenge asks us to unite and, whatever your role, to do more together. We had an increased focus in 2023. With reporting, we had several different categories: planting, cleanup, pulling, monitoring, burning, education, and other. And we also had a donate initiative where we were asking folks to help us meet our match goal. The donations matched 1-to-1 for the duration of TSN Spring Challenge. So now, drum roll, please. Spring Challenge 2023 results. So in 2022, you may remember that we did 36,735 total hours. And our 2023 total was 50,817 hours. That is an incredible increase from last year, and we're so excited that we were able to accomplish that together. So thank you to everyone that participated. You can see up on the chart the comparison of last year's numbers this year. And we had a great mix of submissions. So various different categories are represented here, and we're really glad to be able to open up the challenge to more than just invasive species pulling, and to document all of the different stewardship activities that are happening. So in 2022, we had the most participants we've ever recorded, which was 7,133. And in 2023, we did 13,604 participants in the Spring Challenge. Once again, an incredible increase, and you can see the comparison in the top right of the screen there. So now I would love to talk to you about the honors, our winners of the Spring Challenge. And so we'll start with the Community Cup. And this is awarded to the TSN member community reporting the most total stewardship hours. And here we have the Huron Arbor Cluster that was able to win. So congratulations to the Huron Arbor Cluster, always a great contender in the Spring Challenge. And I have to shout out the Great Lakes Islands Alliance, as they made a really great push at the end to almost catch them. But congrats to Huron Arbor Cluster on winning the Community Cup. Next, we have the Root Cup, and that's awarded to the organization reporting the most total pounds of invasive species or invasive plants removed. And that goes to the West Michigan Conservation Network, again, the TSN member community. And we need to give a shout out to the Lake St. Clair SISMA, because they were also very close to catching West Michigan. We love the competition element of the challenge. Obviously, we appreciate anybody that participates at whatever level, but love a little bit of friendly competition. Next is the Partner Cup. So this is awarded to the organization reporting the most total stewardship hours from outside of our TSN member community network. And that goes to Milwaukee River Keepers, helping our waters thrive since '95. And I need to shout out Alliance for the Great Lakes, and that was last year's winner for coming in very close. And we also have Restoration Agricultural Development and David Borneman LLC as close contenders in that Partner Cup. So thank you so much for participating. And we have the Teacher Cup. So this is a new award this year, awarded to the organization reporting the most total education hours. And that goes to our very own Great Lakes Islands Alliance. So thank you so much to GLIA for participating in the challenge. And they were doing an incredible nature program, which was a large part of their success this year. And so just want to appreciate them. And for the Solo Cup, awarded to the unaffiliated individual or family reporting the most total stewardship hours. And with that award, we have Whitney Field, who I think is in attendance with us today. So congratulations to Whitney, and thank you so very much for being a part of the challenge. Once again, the challenge is meant to celebrate everybody, whether you're representing an organization or a member community, or if you're just out there in the field by yourself, because everybody is a part of it. And we hope that your individual efforts being a part of the challenge make you feel like you're a part of a larger team. Your support matters to us, and we had a one-to-one fundraising goal this year of $20,000, and we know that that is not a small number. Our fundraising goals have varied in springtime, and we were confident that with this increased incentive of the match that we could hit our $20,000 goal. And our actual fundraising this year came out to $21,722. That is incredible, and we set an ambitious goal, and we could not have done it without your support. And we accomplished it together. So thank you all very much for your financial support. And the one-to-one match impact of that is $43,444, doubling the impact of the donations that we received. So thank you all for being a part of it. And truly, as you know, at the Stewardship Network, we could not do this work without your help. So again, the 2023 Spring Challenge has come to a close, running from April 12th to June 30th. And we look forward to having you as a part of the challenge next year. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Travis Anklam, Projects and Education Coordinator at the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at the University of Montana. And the presentation will be Growing the Global Stewardship Movement, Lessons from Connecting Australian and US Practitioners. So with that, Travis, I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Super fun too to see that challenge results and everyone's contributions. Appreciate that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Get my screen up here. Is that showing up for y'all?
Looks great.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Really excited to be here with all of you to share a little bit about Global Landscape Stewards and this international peer exchange that we co-hosted with Australian partners and US stewardship practitioners last fall. Just briefly, Global Landscape Stewards is seeking to connect stewardship practitioners really around landscape stewardship in the international arena. We're reaching out to folks all over the globe for peer exchange, shared learnings, and the transferring of lessons, ideas, and the building of connections that can feed into a global movement around stewardship. Global Landscape Stewards is a project of the Stewardship Network, and I'm super grateful for y'all's support and just really helping us get up on our feet and carry over this exchange last year. So today I'm going to be talking about growing a global stewardship movement, lessons from this exchange. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background on who I am and how we came to host this exchange with Australian partners. And then I'll share some specific lessons from that and kind of what we're thinking in terms of next steps. Just want to start by sharing a little bit about where I call home. So I live in Missoula, Montana. This is a picture of the University of Montana campus, kind of down in the left there, and we've got downtown up in the right side, and the Clark Fork River, which is a tributary of the Columbia flowing through. Missoula sits on the Aboriginal homelands of the Salish and Gillespie people, who now, along with the Kootenai or Kasanka people, are part of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Just want to acknowledge their vision for stewardship in this landscape and their enduring efforts to steward land and waters on their reservation just north of Missoula and then also across the broader region. So as Rob said, I work for the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy, and we do a lot really under the banner of connecting people to place and one another for the benefit of all. Work closely with the Stewardship Network on a number of different projects and networks, and our work is pretty diverse. We're based at the university, and we do have an on-campus graduate certificate program in natural resources conflict resolution, which really equips and empowers students across the university in building their collaborative leadership skills, how they can work really across perspectives, jurisdictions, business models, all of that in the natural resources space. And then we also do a lot of facilitation and mediation work with state and federal agencies, tribal nations, conservation nonprofits, community-based groups, private lands groups who are really in that working lands, kind of private lands conservation space. And then we also work with a number of networks, including several that are housed within the stewardship network. And a lot of our work is kind of motivated by this idea that governments and organizations and communities are increasingly working to find collaborative stewardship solutions and approaches to some of the challenges they're facing. I think instead of just focusing within the boundaries of a particular protected area or a corner of a valley or a watershed, increasingly a lot of folks are looking at watershed scale stewardship and restoration, large landscape scale stewardship and restoration, and seeing how the pieces of our economy, our society, our environment all affect one another, and are trying to work across those scales, perspectives, jurisdictions to be more effective in a bigger way. And they're also struggling in many cases with how to effectively and equitably enact these collaborative approaches at scale. So all the different entities that I named who come to us for support really are coming, I think, from this desire to bring people together to care for people in place at a larger scale than they maybe have been in the past, or in new ways than they have in the past. And one such entity that's reached out to us is the California Landscape Stewardship Network, which is, as I said earlier, a network of the Stewardship Network. The California Landscape Stewardship Network really came together in 2016 when 6 landscape scale collaboratives looked at each other and said, look, we're working on all of these stewardship opportunities and through these challenges in our home regions, but we're going up against some barriers, and we're kind of running out of tools in some cases to address some of the more complex challenges. Could there be benefit in us connecting with one another across the state to transfer some of those lessons learned, to see if there's tools that are working in other landscapes that could help in our landscapes, and then also see if there's some bigger systemic barriers, whether it be policy or a lack of funding, that they could put their heads together on and kind of scale up and marshal some of those resources and support and changes that can enable them to steward at scale in a way that they may not have been able to in the past. What that's led to is a ton of different initiatives and bringing together a lot of partners, including government agencies, nonprofits, community-based groups across the state. Right now, California Network reaches about 40% of the land based in California in terms of the representation of different groups that are there. It's led to some enduring partnerships with state agencies. One example I often like to share is this Cutting Green Tape initiative. A lot of these California-based groups were trying to increase the pace and scale of forest restoration or other restoration efforts, and we're bumping up against some real big challenges in terms of the time it takes to get permits and all the paperwork that's required and all the different agencies that you have to connect with in order to do something like a prescribed burn on a cross-jurisdictional stretch of forest. And they said, look, a lot of these regulations are here to protect the environment, but given the pace and scale of the challenges we're facing, we need to act in a way that's commensurate with the complexity of those challenges and the scale of those challenges, and we need to be able to act a little bit faster. So are there some of these regulations that we could simplify or streamline or even cut altogether, what they're calling green tape, that could enable them to increase the pace and scale of beneficial restoration and stewardship efforts? And so they worked with state agencies. You can imagine a lot of folks were anxious about this, right? Like, is this going to open the door to some bad actors? Is this going to enable folks to act in a way that's not environmentally beneficial? But they were able to really work through with a broad coalition of partners, a set of laws that would enable them to streamline these processes. Passed this through the California legislature, got the governor's stamp, and it's really a great success story that's enabled some, increased restoration efforts to proliferate across the state in a way that they maybe hadn't been before. And a lot of that came from bringing folks together across different perspectives at a statewide scale to really catalyze that change. There's also a number of different efforts that have spawned from this network around capacity building and skills for collaboration. A lot of folks who are in conservation and stewardship come from a science or policy background and may not have had the education or opportunity to build their skills in relationship building, trust building, working across a lot of different perspectives. I know when I went into the environmental field, I was really excited to get outside and kind of be alone with trees and wildlife and mountains and streams and all that. And I quickly bumped up against the need to have some people skills. Because if I care about a forest, I'll need to probably work with some other people to do that. So the network has been developing trainings, workshops, webinars, different toolkits and documents that folks can read up on to build their set of approaches. And then they've also been developing a collaborative leadership development program called Collaborating Well that seeks to provide workshops and trainings to help people boost their ability to work across boundaries. Another piece in this is really thinking regionally and helping folks kind of scale up how they're conceptualizing the task of stewardship to that landscape level. A lot of what this has looked like is working with different networks to increase fire resiliency, think about how stewardship could be enacted, say, across the entire Lake Tahoe basin in the Sierras, or across the entire Santa Cruz Mountains, and really taking those lessons from a statewide scale and then bringing them to those specific locales to support their work. And the last piece, which is really what the rest of the presentation is all about and what our exchange was about in Australia, is advancing peer learning across boundaries, cultures, and sectors at scale. I think really feeling like, gosh, if we stay in our silos and we try to, tackle these challenges in our home locales, we might not necessarily have all the tools and approaches that we need to be effective. And so if we can connect with our peers in other spaces, it's not that, one lesson in one watershed is going to necessarily carry to all watersheds, but it might carry to a few, and that can help us do our work more effectively. And as the network has been operating now for close to a decade, they've really been building on innovative and collaborative solutions in California and thinking about, okay, we've been able to achieve a lot of success at a statewide level. Can we connect this to other networks nationally, like the Network for Landscape Conservation, or even look globally to do some of this work in an international scale? I think in 2020, 2021, a lot of this work felt a little bit more urgent, right? The pandemic sets in, all of a sudden we're glued to our screens and we're starting to see in a bigger way than maybe we had before some of the impacts of climate change through flooding, wildfires. I think there's this urgency at the turn of the decade around 30 by 30 and really conserving at a greater pace and scale than we have in the past. I think also a lot of attention around justice issues, equity issues, particularly in California, a lot of focus on access, who is involved in stewardship and conservation, who benefits from stewardship and conservation, and then particularly with Indigenous communities, how can there be opportunities to reconcile the harms in the past, not erase them necessarily, or pretend that they did not happen, but really come to grips with them and seek better relationship between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. I think this was a lot of the motivations that the network has been having in California as they look outward to carry these lessons nationally and internationally. They approached our center around doing global peer learning really with this opportunity of saying, look, we've had success in exchanging practices and sharing resources and kind of crowdsourcing solutions, if you will, at a statewide level and facilitating this collective action. Could we bring this to a global stage and think about doing similar work, at least starting with an exchange for a couple of weeks with some practitioners from California and maybe other places in the US to connect with folks who are doing this work in another region of the globe and do some of the same kinds of work that the network is doing with those folks. The big question was, where do we go? Where do we start? Where is there an opportunity to build these relationships and connections across people and landscapes? We kind of started providing some support from our center to the network around a bit of an organizational structure. That's where this global landscape stewards notion came from, of saying, look, there's landscape stewards all over the planet. Do we have the opportunity to connect them with one another in ways that current international forums are not doing that work? We started thinking about, okay, who would we want to be involved in some sort of global peer exchange among stewardship practitioners? we felt like it would be important to have folks from different scales. So working at the local scale in a community-based group, at a statewide level or regional level, and then folks who are working nationally and internationally. So started reaching out across our networks to see if there might be individuals who are interested. We also felt like it would be really important to have representation from different sectors, folks from government, folks from the nonprofit arena, community-based groups, from working landscapes, from tribal communities and tribal nations. And so we started pulling together a team that would be representative of a lot of those different entities for really what we saw as a pilot exchange. We also reached out globally for conversation around some of the themes that we felt would be maybe resonant with people in many different communities. So, we're hoping to have an exchange to seek new ways to connect and convene, to build trust and connectivity. Maybe there's ways that folks are coming together in a place like India or Tanzania or Kenya, kind of the Masai Mara ecosystem, that would be really innovative and instructive to us here in the States. And maybe there's lessons around how we're convening folks for different events here that could be transferable there. We also felt like there'd be value in building a stronger international community around landscape stewardship, to have that solidarity and connection and support at that scale, but also to be able to provide larger context for our local work. What are the lessons from other landscapes that can really inform what we're doing, say, in my home region in the Northern Rockies? We also are really interested in best practices. And I think this is an interesting one when you think about the history of conservation, at least in the United States and a lot of the Western world, where conservation has been closely tied to colonism. And a lot of what conservation has looked like in the international arena has been European countries or the United States or Western countries kind of bringing and imposing conservation practices like fortress conservation on other parts of the world. And so we wanted to take a lot of care in this and say, look, let's focus on the connection, let's focus on supporting that and see what best practices bubble up. Maybe we have a ton to learn from what might be happening in another region, and maybe there'd be some best practices from our landscapes that could be transferable, but not presuppose that we know what's best for some other community. We also wanted to focus on not just the successes, but also the challenges, like be able to really workshop what are those common challenges that we're really struggling with, and what kinds of breakthroughs or approaches that have worked in different settings might help us effectively work through those challenges. I think another piece that was really important for us as we were doing some outreach to discern where we might go is what are approaches to storytelling, right? Like, which story of stewardship is resonant with which communities? How are we even creating these stories, right? Is it just one set of folks who are setting the story for what stewardship looks like, or are we taking an inclusive approach to storytelling that helps people see themselves in stewardship and be inspired to act as a steward? And then last, really feeling like Indigenous-led stewardship is critical to our ability to steward our landscapes. At least for me in Montana, it's critical working with our tribal partners. They have so much wisdom and experience in this landscape. Salish and Klespe people, as an example, and Missoula have lived in this landscape for at least 10,000 years, right? So there's a ton of connection to that landscape, a lot of value in listening and learning with our Indigenous partners. And so what are some approaches that are really effective in supporting Indigenous-led stewardship and priorities, and bringing together local knowledge and scientific knowledge with traditional knowledge? That was a key interest of us as we went out in search of exchange. And as we were kind of reconnecting with folks all over the globe, one of our colleagues, Gary Tabor with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, said to us, hey, my wife's Australian. I've spent a lot of time in Australia with her family. Can only take so much family time sometimes, and have built a lot of relationships with the conservation and stewardship community across that continent. And he really urged us to connect with some Australians to see if that might be a landscape we could go to, particularly because in 2021, when we were starting to queue up our planning for this exchange, they dropped their State of the Environment report, which is a really comprehensive look at the state of the environment in Australia. I just want to share a brief video that speaks a little bit to what's in that report and kind of the tone that Australia is taking as a country over the last couple of years around stewardship.
We've been caring for country, our environment, since the beginning. In return, country takes care of us. But a lot has changed, and our environment is under stress. In a rapidly changing world, our country needs healing. The state of the environment brings together scientific, traditional, and local knowledge. We can turn things around by working together and learning from each other. Walking together, we can heal country for our future. This is the state of the environment.
And so as you can see from that short video, the Australian government, I think nationally, has really been responding to the complex challenges that they're facing in the stewardship arena over the last several years in a very serious and I think nuanced way. And so we started reaching out to some Australian colleagues who are engaged in landscape stewardship across the country, and really found some striking similarities with the context in the US, particularly the Western US, where a lot of our exchange team was coming from, and thought, gosh, we need to connect. This seems like a really good fit for a first stewardship exchange in this international space. Just a few things about Australia to illustrate the similarities and opportunities for exchange. So Australia is a vast, very dry continent and country. It's been inhabited by indigenous peoples for at least 60,000 years. Some really impressive evidence in cultural history around agriculture for a much longer period of time than other parts of the region, contrary to popular narratives around the advancement of civilization globally. So really just a rich history of human coevolution and habitation and stewardship on that continent by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Australia also has a population of about 30 million. Most of that's concentrated in large cities, especially along the kind of southeast coast. I think my cursor is kind of going around here. So it's kind of a nice mountain range that spreads along here. A lot of forest, agricultural land. It's actually pretty wet along the coast here and down into Tasmania. Then as you get into the central part of the continent, you get to the outback and it gets much drier. Private lands conservation is a huge part of the landscape and stewardship there. About 62% of the land in Australia is privately owned, which is really similar to the US. So a lot of opportunities to work with ranchers and farmers and forest owners there. Also democracy, organized somewhat similarly to the United States in terms of scales of government, and a lot of similar economic characteristics to the US, just at a slightly smaller scale by population and GDP, but very large scale by actual surface area and space. We built a lot of connections just through outreach with folks who we thought we might want to engage in exchange with, and started to create an itinerary for a visit that would take us along the eastern part of the continent, really connecting with some government, but specifically initiatives and stewardship entities that are operating across jurisdictions. A lot of folks in the private lands conservation space, some land conservancies, and then a couple of organizations that are doing some really strong partnerships with indigenous communities across the continent as well. We took about 3 weeks to travel over there. We were able to secure some funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and then work with our Australian partners to get some funding from the Ian Potter Foundation to support their participation as well. So the vast majority of the folks who participated were funded to participate, which was a great benefit that we could bring forward. And most of the time we were connecting over meals or for cups of tea or pints, got out into the field to some different restoration sites, were able to attend a couple of different conferences, and really see what the work of landscape stewardship is looking like in many different spaces across Eastern Australia, and with many different kinds of partnerships as well. as we were going through the exchange, these are some of the key themes that came up, some of which I've already mentioned. First Nations-led stewardship, policy, governance, conservation finance was a huge topic of conversation. They just had a major change at the federal government in terms of the interest, I guess, in taking climate change and biodiversity conservation and working with indigenous communities a little bit more seriously than they maybe have over the last 10 years or so. Also, just a lot of interest in working across sectors to fund conservation. Their philanthropy sector is considerably smaller than ours is. And so there's a big push to use carbon credits and biodiversity credits and other schemes to invest in nature and in stewardship, which was really quite interesting to learn from. Also, like in the United States, a big interest in connectivity conservation, kind of moving outside of just protected areas and thinking about, where are there opportunities to work in communities, with cities and counties, private landowners to really connect habitat across a larger landscape. Also, a lot of interest in wildfire and disaster resiliency. They had those absolutely insane wildfires or bushfires in 2020, 2021. When we arrived in the fall of 2022 for our exchange, huge flooding across the country. We had quite a bit of plans change because many of the communities we had sought to visit with were not accessible due to pretty disastrous flooding. And then, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of shared interest around collaborative approaches, how to engage communities more broadly, and then private lands conservation as well. So I think, I'm just going to hone in on a couple of these themes and share some lessons that we walked away with from the exchange. First Nations stewardship was huge in Australia. It was really striking. Like, you land in the country and they're like, welcome to Brisbane. And then they also acknowledge the traditional owners, the indigenous people of the place in which you're landing. You go to get a cup of coffee in the airport, and it's like printed on the cup, the acknowledgement of indigenous people. And as we went to all these different events, there were a lot of land acknowledgements. It was almost always the case when any speaker would step up that they would provide that land acknowledgement. It was also common to invite indigenous peoples to do a welcome to country, to, in their own words, welcome folks to their homeland. And that was pretty common as well. And then as we got to connect with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across the country, learned a lot about different Indigenous-led efforts to steward land. Lots of Indigenous protected areas are being formed and have existed across the country. There's also some really incredible Indigenous-led organizations that are creating, not just a carbon credit scheme, but a cultural credit scheme, so that you're not just buying a carbon credit that's investing in carbon sequestration on a plot of land, but it's being done in a way that is culturally appropriate for the indigenous peoples of that area, which was really quite an interesting model. And as we got to talk with more of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues over there, similar challenges, I think, to here, where it's great to see the proliferation of this acknowledgement and the prioritization of First Nations in stewardship. But for many, that wasn't followed up with action. I think there was a couple of folks who said to us, look, we just want our land back. Like, these words are great, and it feels like there's greater transparency there and inclusion there. But in the end, I think that honoring of self-determination and sovereignty is something that a lot of folks shared. They still have a long ways to go on, but that there's some great change in the works as well. I think when we look to the lessons we can carry forward, I think there's some specific models of First Nations leading stewardship work that we've been carrying back to our home landscapes and communities here in the US. And then, one thing that was striking, especially in some of our meetings in some of the urban areas in Australia, we'd be in like Melbourne at a bunch of meetings with conservation organizations, and primarily all the folks in the room in these meetings were white or of European ancestry. We'd walk out on the street, incredibly diverse cities by and large, a lot of folks of South Asian ancestry from East Africa, Eastern Asia, Polynesia, just a hugely diverse country, and yet there was not a lot of engagement we saw in stewardship with those communities. And it's really interesting because voting's compulsory in Australia, right? So you'd think there'd be a strong incentive, given that everyone has to vote, to engage all communities, but we found that in many cases that wasn't the situation. And so could there be opportunities to carry successes and challenges and lessons from the US over to our Australian colleagues to support them being more inclusive in how they're approaching stewardship and ensuring that the benefits of stewardship are reaching all members of their citizenry and their communities. Another theme that really emerged is stitching together these regional initiatives with these local groups. And Australia has this really phenomenal movement called land care. In the late 80s, essentially the Australian equivalent of the Farmers Union and a large network of conservation groups in the country came together and said, look, we can have working landscapes and do stewardship at the same time in a way that is good for country, it's good for our bottom line, but we really need the backbone support and the resources to bring these partnerships together and sustain them. So they got the federal government to provide funding to support coordination capacity for community-led land care groups, or basically like watershed partnerships, to do this work all across the country. And now there are over 5,000 land care groups in existence, or different kinds of care groups that might be like forest care, RC care, or different things like that. So just a like wildly popular program funded by the federal government that has had a huge impact at a big scale that is directly funding locally led stewardship. So it's still their priorities, really carrying things forward. And I think that was a really inspiring model to learn from, to think about, look, we've got hundreds, if not thousands of these locally based collaborative and partnership groups across the United States. Is this a model that we could carry forward to support funding and sustaining those entities beyond, having to chase after those grant cycles, or really be dependent on, raising your own money from different revenue streams. And I think the last theme that I'll mention is it's just Australia's overall reckoning with bringing together all of the different systems and sectors to try and tackle these challenges that they're facing in terms of climate, biodiversity, and inequalities across their country. Really enjoyed a particular event where we participated in a conservation finance intensive that brought together folks from the conservation community and stewardship community with folks in finance and the private sector around how do we increase our investments in nature. And for them, like, it doesn't seem as though addressing climate change and biodiversity loss, in inequalities and honoring Indigenous sovereignty is in like separate silos. They're really bringing them all together into financing schemes and programs that are not just like a whole of government, but a whole society approach, which I think is really fascinating. Certainly a lot of challenges there, but there's a lot to learn from their context and kind of carry those lessons, into our world here in the US. And then at the same time, they are really running up against what seems to be an incredibly competitive environment. They have much less philanthropic resources than we do, and Australians love sport. Like, they have an entire holiday that has 2 days off from work for like half the country around a horse race. It's like really a huge part of their culture, and that kind of competition seems to permeate across the conservation and stewardship sector, especially. We had, some groups that we were working with who would just outright talk bad and smack about each other behind, each other's backs, like in our exchange conversations, and some points that bubbled up to just like outright tension in the conversation in ways that weren't productive. And I felt like there's a lot to learn from some of the successful collaborative approaches that are happening in the US, certainly like on a national scale, we've got quite a bit of divisiveness and division, but there's also some really rich, long-standing examples of folks setting aside their differences and coming together at a large scale in Montana, in California, and other parts of the country, that I think are some great lessons to bring to our Australian colleagues and support them and getting past some of that competition where it might not be helpful. In terms of like the outcomes and impacts that we felt like we catalyzed in addition to kind of these lessons, our coming over there really provided an opportunity from some of our Australian colleagues to come together and, despite some of that competition and conflict, connect for events that they hadn't connected around in the past. One such example was a connectivity conference that we participated in that brought together a number of folks from across the continent and other countries to learn from one another around connectivity conservation. There was an event that was already planned, but there definitely was some added excitement and reaching out to broader audiences once we signed up to participate in that and kind of plan our trip around being able to participate in that. Another conversation and event that we supported, which was a huge one, was the bringing together of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, which is a consortium of different conservation and stewardship groups that work nationally in Australia, with the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network, which is a consortium of different environmental funders, private and philanthropic funders across the country. They definitely had a relationship before, but they hadn't had an event or a workshop where they've been able to get together and just connect to talk about funding priorities and common challenges and opportunities. I think there had been a lot of hesitancy around an event where you bring a bunch of conservation groups and philanthropists together as just kind of devolving into a pitch session or a pitch fest. And I think the funders were a little nervous about that. And instead, I think we were able to almost like play a bit of a moderating role by being there to say, look, we're just curious to learn how philanthropy and the conservation community in Australia is working together. Let's engage with this and see where there's opportunities to better coordinate going forward. And it was a big success, and they've been able to strengthen their relationships and have similar conversations since then. Also, just a lot of renewed energy and innovation, particularly around conservation finance. There's some great tax schemes in the US that local communities and counties have used to, say, get levies to purchase open space for public benefit. That's at the will of voters. And some of that was stuff that our Australian colleagues really hadn't been exposed to. So I think being able to have that just pure exchange of solutions and approaches to stewardship challenges was really invigorating for our US team and our Australian colleagues as well. Also just network building, like we connected with hundreds of people while we were over there, have had some enduring friendships where we're talking, bi-weekly or quarterly with our Australian colleagues around specific themes and swapping lessons from our work in ways that are really expanding how we're thinking about stewardship in our home landscapes and with our partners, certainly here in the Northern Rockies. A lot of shared science and stewardship practices that we're transferring around. And I think there's some interest in co-authoring and co-developing different toolkits and things that we can share more broadly with other stewardship practitioners all around the globe. And then we've also got some Australian conservation and stewardship leaders who are coming over here this fall to visit with us, which we're really excited about. Just a few documents I'll name that we'll have on our webpage on the Stewardship Network website that I can share at the end of the presentation. We created a summary report that just shares some of the themes and key insights and lessons that we walked away from our exchange with, really from the perspective of the US team, but definitely provide some great links to different tools and approaches and organizational models that I think are really inspiring when thinking about landscape stewardship here in the States. We're also working on a stewardship exchange handbook that is a guide for planning and facilitating these kinds of international peer exchanges. A lot of basic lessons that we learned, like a couple of meetings started with essentially a roster of just like hours of PowerPoint presentations. And we're like, had to pump the brakes a little bit, like, whoa, we didn't plan this big exchange and come across the country and y'all take a ton of time out to engage with stuff that we could maybe just access online. Like, let's have some shared dialogue. Let's get to know each other. Let's have some time for informal exchange, walking out on country, or connecting for a meal, where we can really get to know each other and forge deeper relationships there that are going to be durable and last beyond, so that we don't have to get it all out, in this one exchange, but we can continue to have that relationship going forward. And so we hope that can serve as one set of ideas and approaches that folks could use when creating these kinds of exchanges going forward. We're also thinking about, how do we evolve this work into the future? We definitely want to do more of these exchanges. We're thinking about virtual opportunities. We're thinking about other resources that we can develop and co-develop with international networks and other partner organizations. This is just a slice of what we're hoping to do over the next couple of years, from a bit of a strategic roadmap document that we've developed that shares a little bit about global landscape stewards and why we're looking to grow this global network around landscape stewardship. I'll just draw attention to a couple of the things we're really excited to jump into, is fostering peer exchange and relationships in a continuous way. So we're looking to host some webinars and other virtual events, and we're also looking towards a next in-person exchange, I think really with a lot of attention to who we're including in that and making sure that it's accessible, and that we're maybe having a cohort that's from lots of different countries around the world, is bringing in emerging leaders in this space, is maybe giving access to these kinds of conversations and resources for folks who often don't get the mic, or who often are not at the forefront of these processes, to really be able to benefit from these kinds of exchanges. Also building a lot of knowledge and capacity through developing resources and just sharing these kinds of resources around the globe. And then we're thinking about, gosh, we're want to support the global stewardship movement. We want to grow this global network, but we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So where is there connectivity already? We're really going to be reaching out to a broad swath of stewardship practitioners around the globe to understand where we see opportunities to stitch together greater connectivity to, enable best practices and successful stewardship approaches to proliferate all around the globe and bring greater resources to bear, and maybe also affect, international scale change in a lot of different areas around landscape stewardship. And then I think, like I said, broadening our global landscape stewards team to be inclusive of a greater diversity of folks, and recognize that landscape stewardship should be for everyone, and it should be inclusive of everyone. And so if we're going to call ourselves global landscape stewards, we should probably be representative of the diversity of landscape stewards that are out there as well. So really appreciate the opportunity to present at this webcast, share a little bit about global landscape stewards. If you want to learn more and access some of the documents that I just referenced, you can go to www.stewardshipnetwork.org /global landscape stewards and access all of those things and more. And we hope to have more events posted on that webpage that folks can participate in and engage with down the line. So thank you so much, Rob and Bob. And yeah, happy to answer any questions that folks have, or clarify anything that I talked quickly past.
That was so great. Thank you so much, Travis. Really appreciate it. I was living vicariously through you while I was thinking about and listening to your presentation. But so a couple questions in the chat, and I also have a couple prepared of my own. But we'll start off with a fun one. What was the most impactful or fun moment for you on the trip?
Yeah, there was so like most of us got COVID while we were there, which was not fun, but it was really cool how different partners who we had never really connected with in person until we were there came together to problem solve around what can be a really emotional and for some folks, definitely a life-threatening or at least scary health-wise event. I feel like our US team really was supportive and helped, do the basic things of like getting people food and a separate space and just tending to that care in a way that enabled people to, heal up before heading home. And then many of our partners like pivoted and created events where we could be outside and wear masks and sit far enough away and still engage in meaningful conversation. But then we're just really honest too around, hey, like we're going to do a field trip with some Aboriginal leaders around kind of like rainforest stewardship and bushfire. And it's like, look, that community is really vulnerable. We want to respect and honor, what their needs and priorities are. So let's not go there and connect with them in a virtual way, or learn from, some of the documents and videos that they have online. And just like the care that came forward amongst these folks who we had just started a relationship with was really powerful. And I think that's where you, in an ironic way, can build some really strong relationships too.
Absolutely. It kind of forces you to, come together as a team and, like you said, problem solve. And so, yeah, that sounds like a challenging, but ultimately kind of heartening experience. And then similar to that, could you share any anecdotes of the ways that the trip impacted the work or perspective or thought of individual colleagues that traveled with you? Like what were the things that you were talking about in your travels home before you did like the full debrief? What were the patterns that emerged for you all?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of definitely a few specific examples. So we met with one land trust in the state of Victoria, which is where Melbourne is, kind of in southeastern Australia, called Trust for Nature. And they have been doing conservation easements on private lands for a super long time, but they increasingly are delving into the space of cultural easements, of saying, how can we not just for perpetuity guarantee conservation on this property, but guarantee access for the indigenous people who call this place home, and not just access, but also like governance and a say in what happens on this land that is their home country. And so we were able to do some workshopping over there around some examples from the States and some examples from there, and then have continued to stay in touch now back in the States with our Australian colleagues, as some of our home networks and partners are seeking to do the exact same thing. And there are some really good examples of cultural easements actually in the Great Lakes region, especially. There's a couple of tribes in Michigan who have done that with other private lands partners, but they're few and far between at a national scale. And so I think this helps us, really make those connections in a way that is directly informing our work over there and here. And at least I can, say for some of our colleagues here that some of the lessons I engage with have directly informed the conversations I've been facilitating in Montana.
That's excellent. Yeah, I can think of one example, if I'm not mistaken, at Oakland University in Southeast Michigan that's doing a project similar to that, where they're not only setting aside a portion of their land for, again, the more traditional uses of the land, but also for those cultural practices. And I will look more into that and share that with you, but that's excellent. Thank you for sharing. I think into transition, because I know that there will be some opportunities for folks to stay in touch via the website and such about kind of like the outcomes and, continued kind of lessons from this. But finally, just a question about talking about the future of global landscape stewards and wanting to create a truly representative cohort and continuing the program. Do you have any preview or any ideas about where you'll go next or what the next steps are for the program in that regard?
Yeah, I think like where we might host an exchange is going to be really dependent on like shared criteria. I feel like we did a pretty good job of co-creating this exchange with our Australian colleagues. I feel like, some of our Indigenous colleagues who participated in the exchange really felt like they were delighted to, be a part of it, but at points felt like, we'd be in a conversation with some colleagues over there and they felt like, oh, I'm kind of the weight of like needing to speak for all Native Americans is kind of being put on me right now. That doesn't feel great. And so I think for our Indigenous colleagues, like having a cohort that includes multiple Indigenous participants would be super helpful. And then I also feel like there was, a lot of interest in the fire and like how kind of collaboration around fire management and prescribed burns is taking place in different geographies. And so I think, a location where that is a big component of the work is huge. We've also had this conversation around like democracy and like, what does stewardship look like in an authoritarian regime? Like, can you really engage in collaborative stewardship in the same way as we might in some countries even though there's different levels of democracy status, right, in the West for sure. But how do we make sure that we're going to places where the lessons transfer, or maybe there would be benefit in going to a place with a totally different political system, so that there's that like seeding of lessons across those. So I don't know, we haven't really been like, oh, let's go to, you know, India or Tanzania or Bulgaria. It's been more like, what are the criteria that will support the flow of these best practices, and how do we make sure we're hitting on some of the key themes that are really important to our communities here in the States.
Yeah, incredible challenge and opportunity there, looking at all the different variables, and you know, you can't control for all of them or even the majority of them. And so how do you look at what the themes are and then what the differences are, and pulling that all together? But you know, really exciting work that you all are doing, and really important work, and looking forward to seeing how it keeps going. But thank you so very much, Travis, for being a part of this. This was really great, and we appreciate you sharing all of your insights and information with us. So
yeah, and I really appreciate the Stewardship Network too. I feel like, you know, Lizzie was like doing so much work to help us track our expenses and receipts and like keep all those systems straight too. And those logistics are key to the success of an event like this. So much gratitude.
Yeah, that's great, and love giving Lizzie some spotlight, because she's doing a lot of hard work behind the scenes to help not only, you know, our organization, but you know, our partners. That, and Lizzie's right in there, so I haven't saying happy to support. So that's great. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Travis, and I will now transition to a couple of our outro slides for folks. So just give me a moment to pull those up for everybody. Forgive me, it's not letting me. Well, I'm just going to do it like this. Okay, are you seeing my full screen then? Does that look all right to you, Travis? Great, awesome. So just so everybody's aware, the stewardshipnetwork.org/webcast page is revamped and it is live. So you can now register for our next episode. You can preview and plan for future episodes of the webcast series, and you can replay up to 2 years back of episodes at a glance. So we encourage you to check out not only this recording, feel free to share it with your colleagues, but also any past recordings we have and future recordings that are coming up. So our next TSN monthly webcast is coming up on August 9th, 2023. And we are really excited to host Sean Johnson from the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy for the presentation Beyond the First Horizon, Exploring Tomorrow's Stewardship Opportunities. And happy to say that Sean was involved in the project that Travis had mentioned as well, and is also a board member at the Stewardship Network. We are extremely grateful to have him. And so we hope that you all will join us for that presentation. And with that, I will say thank you. And we appreciate all of you for being here. And we hope you have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week.